Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like mist across still water. I am so glad you have found your way here, to this gentle space designed for rest, for wonder, and for the slow, peaceful drift towards sleep. Tonight, we embark together on a mystery wrapped in fog and firelight, a tale of curious occurrences along the ancient Thames, where shadows dance and secrets whisper through the gaslit streets of Victorian London. There is no need to follow every word with vigilance. Simply allow the story to wash over you like a warm tide, carrying away the tensions of your day, inviting your thoughts to soften and slow. Perhaps you're nestled beneath blankets, or perhaps you sit in the comfortable darkness of your own sacred space. Wherever you are welcome here. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling over London for 3 days without ceasing, a gentle, persistent whisper against the windows of 291B Baker Street. Inside, the sitting room glowed with the amber warmth of a coal fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the papered walls, adorned with maps, diagrams, and the accumulated curiosities of countless investigations. The air held that particular comfort found only on such evenings. The scent of burning coal mingling with the rich aroma of pipe tobacco, the faint perfume of old leather from the chairs, and underneath it all, the clean, cool smell of rain-washed air seeping through the edges of the window panes. Sherlock Holmes sat in his customary chair, long legs stretched toward the fire, fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, in an attitude of profound contemplation. The firelight painted his angular features in shades of gold and shadow, highlighting the intelligent grey eyes that stared, unblinking, into the flames, as though reading some message written there in the language of ember and ash. He had been sitting thus for the better part of an hour, so still that one might have mistaken him for a figure in a painting, were it not for the occasional flutter of his eyelids or the subtle rise and fall of his chest. I, Dr. John Watson, sat across from him in my own well-worn chair, a medical journal resting forgotten in my lap as I watched the rain trail down the window, glass in meandering rivulets. Outside, Baker Street was nearly empty, the gas lamps creating soft halos of light in the dampness, their glow reflecting off the wet cobblestones in shimmering pools. The occasional hansom cab clattered past, hooves splashing through puddles, the sound muffled and distant, as though the rain created a barrier between our warm sanctuary and the world beyond. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea earlier, a proper pot of Darjeeling with 2 cups, a plate of her excellent shortbread biscuits, and a small jug of cream. The tea had grown lukewarm in the pot, untouched by Holmes, though I had poured myself a cup and found comfort in its gentle warmth. The clink of my spoon against the porcelain as I stirred had been the only sound for some minutes, a small, ordinary music in the quietness. "You are restless, Watson," Holmes observed suddenly, his voice soft and contemplative, not moving from his fixed position. "Your spoon has circled that cup 17 times. The sugar dissolved after the 3rd rotation." I smiled, setting the cup down on the side table with a gentle click. "Merely wool gathering, Holmes. The rain has a way of turning one's thoughts inward." "Indeed it does," he murmured, and fell silent once more. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily onward, marking time in its patient, unhurried way. 9:15. The evening stretched before us with that particular quality of timelessness that rainy nights possess, when the world seems to contract to the dimensions of a single room, a single fire, a single moment extended indefinitely. Outside, London continued its vast, breathing existence, but here, in this warm cocoon of lamplight and shadow, there was only peace, only stillness, only the soft sounds of comfort and companionship. Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when the sharp rap of the door knocker echoed up from below, a sound so unexpected in the quietness that I started slightly in my chair. Holmes, however, did not move, though I noticed the faintest suggestion of a smile touch the corners of his mouth. "A visitor," I remarked, unnecessarily. "At this hour, in this weather," Holmes said quietly. "It can only be a matter of some urgency, or perhaps—" His eyes gleamed with sudden interest, something rather more intriguing. We heard Mrs. Hudson's tread upon the stairs, her knock, and then her entrance, bringing with her a small gust of cooler air and the increased sound of rain. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's a gentleman to see you, a Mr. Sebastian Thornwood. He's quite insistent, despite the hour." "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, if you please," Holmes said, unfolding himself from his chair with languid grace, suddenly animated where before he had been still as stone. "And perhaps some fresh tea. I suspect we shall have need of it." Mrs. Hudson withdrew, and Holmes turned to face the door, hands clasped behind his back, transformed in an instant from contemplative philosopher to keen observer, every sense alert. I set aside my journal and straightened in my chair, feeling that familiar stirring of interest that always accompanied the arrival of a new client. The man who entered moments later was perhaps 50 years of age, dressed in a well-tailored but thoroughly soaked overcoat, his hat dripping water onto Mrs. Hudson's clean floor. He was of medium height, with a weathered face that spoke of many years spent outdoors, perhaps at sea. His skin had that particular leathery quality imparted by sun and salt wind. His eyes, however, were what arrested attention, pale blue, anxious, darting about the room with barely concealed agitation, before settling on Holmes with an expression of mingled hope and desperation. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice rough as though unused to speaking at length. "Forgive the intrusion at this hour. I would not have come, but—" He paused, seeming to gather himself. "I have witnessed something that defies all rational explanation, and I am told you are the one man in London who might make sense of it." Holmes gestured toward the chair I had vacated, which I now relinquished, moving to lean against the mantelpiece. "Please, Mr. Thornwood, sit. You are clearly distressed, and quite thoroughly wet. Watson, perhaps you might offer our guest a brandy. Now, sir, compose yourself, and tell us what has brought you out on such an inhospitable evening." Thornwood sank into the chair with evident relief, accepting the glass of brandy I pressed into his cold hands. He took a long draught, then set the glass carefully on his knee, holding it there as though it were an anchor to the solid world. When he spoke again, his voice had steadied somewhat, though the anxiety remained bright in his eyes. I was a river pilot, Mr. Holmes. For 30 years I have guided ships along the Thames, from the estuary to the docks and back again. I know that river as I know my own hands. Every shoal, every current, every mooring. There is nothing upon those waters that I have not seen, or so I believed, until 3 nights past. He paused, taking another sip of brandy, and in the silence The fire crackled softly, a log settling deeper into the grate with a whisper of ash. Holmes had taken his own chair once more, but now he leaned forward slightly, his entire attention focused on our visitor, with that peculiar intensity that characterized his interest in a genuine puzzle. It was late, Thornwood continued, near midnight. The fog had rolled in thick as cotton wool, the way it does sometimes in autumn, so dense you can scarce see your hand before your face. I was guiding a cargo vessel, the Mary Catherine, down toward Gravesend. The tide was with us, and despite the fog, I knew the way by instinct and long practice. The captain trusted my judgment, as they all do. His hands tightened around the brandy glass, the knuckles whitening. We were passing Greenwich, just coming around the great bend when I saw it, emerging from the fog like a ghost made solid. A ship such as I have never seen. A 3-masted vessel, Mr. Holmes, fully rigged, sails billowing, though there was scarce a breath of wind. But it was not the ship itself that chilled my blood. It was the manner of her appearance. She seemed to glow, sir, with a pale phosphorescent light, as though she were made of moonlight and mist rather than wood and canvas. Holmes's eyes had narrowed with interest, but his voice remained gentle, soothing. You say this vessel was moving? Aye, moving swift against the tide, which is impossible without steam or a strong wind, neither of which were present. And there was no sound, Mr. Holmes, no creak of rigging, no splash of bow wave, nothing but an uncanny silence. The Mary Catherine's engines were running, her own passage making noise enough. But this phantom ship, she glided past us, perhaps 50 yards to port, silent as a dream. Did you see anyone aboard? I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. Thornwood turned his pale eyes to me, and I saw in them something that might have been fear or wonder, or both, mingled together. That is the strangest part, Doctor. The deck was not empty. I saw figures moving about, dimly visible in that spectral glow. They seemed to be going about the business of sailing, adjusting lines, moving across the deck, but they were indistinct, as though seen through layers of gauze. And then he stopped, swallowing hard. Yes, Holmes prompted softly. Then one of them looked at me, directly at me, across the water and fog. I cannot say how I knew, for I could not make out features, but I felt that gaze as surely as I feel this chair beneath me. And in that moment, the entire ship simply faded. Like morning mist before the sun, it dissipated into the fog and was gone, leaving nothing but empty water and the sound of our own engines echoing strangely in the darkness. The room had grown very quiet. Even the fire seemed to burn more softly, as though respectful of the tale being told. Holmes sat back in his chair, his fingers once more steepled beneath his chin, his expression thoughtful. A remarkable account, he said finally. Tell me, Mr. Thornwood, have there been other sightings of this vessel? Thornwood nodded slowly. That is why I have come to you. After that night, I made inquiries, discreetly, you understand, for I have a reputation to maintain, and I cannot afford to be thought mad. But I learned that I am not alone. At least 4 other pilots and rivermen have reported similar sightings over the past fortnight. Always in fog, always near Greenwich, always the same glowing ship, moving impossibly against tide and wind. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Mr. Holmes, I am a practical man. I do not believe in ghosts or spirits, but I have seen what I have seen, and I cannot explain it. If there is a rational explanation, If this is some trick or scheme, I must know. The river is my life, sir. I cannot ply my trade in fear. Mrs. Hudson chose that moment to return with fresh tea, the gentle clinking of china, providing a welcome return to the ordinary. She poured for each of us with her usual efficiency, the steam rising in delicate wisps, the scent of Darjeeling mingling with the coal smoke and brandy. When she had withdrawn, closing the door softly behind her, Holmes lifted his cup and gazed into its amber depths as though reading tea leaves. "You have come to the right place, Mr. Thornwood," he said at last, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "This matter interests me greatly. A phantom ship on the Thames. It has the elements of genuine mystery, and I confess I have been rather bored of late. Watson, what do you make of our friend's account?" I considered carefully, warming my hands around my own teacup. The consistency of the sightings suggests something more than mere imagination, or the effect of fog on tired eyes. But a glowing ship passing without sound, it beggars belief. "All puzzles beg a belief until they are solved," Holmes remarked. "That is what makes them puzzles. Mr. Thornwood, I shall take your case. I propose to investigate this matter thoroughly, beginning tomorrow. The fog is forecast to continue for several more days, I believe, which may provide us with an opportunity to observe this phenomenon ourselves." Thornwood's relief was palpable, his shoulders sagging as tension drained away. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I cannot express. That is, I am deeply grateful. Return to your lodgings and rest," Holmes instructed kindly. "Provide Mrs. Hudson with your direction before you leave. I shall contact you within the day regarding our next steps. In the meantime, if you should witness this vessel again, note every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem." After Thornwood had departed, leaving behind only damp spots on the carpet and the lingering scent of river water and anxiety, Holmes stood at the window, gazing out into the rain-washed darkness. I joined him there, and together we watched the gaslight flickering through the steady fall of rain, the street below empty and glistening. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment before answering, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. "I make nothing of it yet, Watson. We have a tale, and tales are unreliable things until they are tested against fact. But there are several aspects that intrigue me. The location. Why always near Greenwich? The timing. Why has this phenomenon appeared only in the last fortnight? And most curious of all, the consistency of description among independent witnesses, who, I suspect, have not compared notes before approaching me." He turned from the window, his expression animated. "No, Watson, this is no simple case of mass hysteria, or the imaginings of superstitious rivermen. There is something occurring on the Thames, something deliberate and planned, I would wager. And tomorrow, when daylight returns and the city awakens, we shall begin the work of unravelling this mystery." The fire had burned lower now, settling into glowing coals that radiated a steady, gentle warmth. Outside, the rain continued its endless whisper against the windows, a lullaby older than London itself. Holmes returned to his chair, his energy already turning inward as his mind began to work upon the problem, sorting and analysing, building hypotheses from fragments. I remained at the window a moment longer, looking out into the darkness toward the river that flowed through the heart of the city, ancient and enduring. Somewhere out there in the fog and rain, a mystery waited to be solved. But for now, in this moment, there was only warmth and safety, the comfort of familiar surroundings, and the promise of adventure to come. The clock struck 10, its chimes soft and measured, marking the passage of time in this quiet sanctuary where mysteries arrived like visitors in the rain, bringing with them questions that would lead us into the unknown. The morning arrived pale and hesitant, the rain having diminished to a fine mist that hung in the air like suspended silk, blurring the edges of buildings and softening the harsh lines of the city into something dreamlike and indistinct. I woke to the sound of Holmes moving about the sitting room, his footsteps light but purposeful, and the occasional rustle of papers being shifted and examined. When I emerged from my bedroom, still fastening my collar, I found him standing before the window, with his back to me, silhouetted against the grey morning light, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. "Ah, Watson," he said, without turning, somehow aware of my presence through that peculiar sixth sense he seemed to possess. "You are awake. Excellent. I have been considering our phantom ship, and I believe our first course of action must be to visit Greenwich itself. The location is too specific to be coincidental." I moved to the breakfast table, where Mrs. Hudson had laid out a simple but satisfying meal. Fresh bread, butter, marmalade, and a pot of strong tea that steamed invitingly in the cool air. As I poured myself a cup, Holmes finally turned from the window, and I could see that he had barely slept, if at all. His eyes held that bright, feverish quality that always appeared when a problem had seized his imagination completely. "Have you eaten?" I asked, knowing the answer already, but feeling compelled by medical training and friendship to inquire. "I require no food when the mind is properly engaged," he replied. But he did cross to the table, and absently took a piece of bread, tearing it into small pieces as he spoke. "I have been consulting my references. Greenwich has a rich maritime history, as you know. The Royal Observatory, the Naval College, the docks. For centuries, it has been intimately connected with England's relationship to the sea. If one wished to stage a maritime mystery, there could be no more symbolically appropriate location." "You believe this is deliberately staged, then?" I asked, spreading marmalade across my toast with care. "Not a genuine supernatural occurrence?" Holmes smiled faintly, finally consuming a piece of the bread he had been methodically destroying. "My dear Watson, I have told you before, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth, and I have yet to encounter a genuine supernatural occurrence that could not, upon investigation, be explained by the actions of human beings with human motives. No, someone is creating this phantom ship for a purpose, and that purpose is what we must uncover." He moved to his desk, where he had spread out a large map of the Thames, marked here and there with pencil notations. I joined him there, tea in hand, and looked down at the winding course of the river as it snaked through London toward the sea. Holmes had circled an area near Greenwich in red pencil, and from this circle he had drawn several lines connecting to other points along the riverbank. I took the liberty of sending a telegram to my brother Mycroft at first light, Holmes explained, tracing one of these lines with a long finger. He has access to shipping records and harbourmaster reports that would take us days to obtain through official channels. I have asked him to provide information on any unusual maritime activity in the Greenwich area over the past month, any ships reported missing or behaving strangely, and any new commercial enterprises that have established themselves along this stretch of river. You suspect a criminal enterprise? I suggested, sipping my tea and studying the map. I suspect purpose, Holmes corrected gently. Whether that purpose is criminal remains to be determined. But consider, Watson, a glowing ship that appears in fog, moving against tide and wind, seen by multiple witnesses who are all experienced rivermen, unlikely to be fooled by simple tricks. This requires resources, planning, and some degree of technical sophistication. It is not the work of a lone madman or a simple hoax. A knock at the door interrupted our discussion, and Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram on her silver tray. Holmes took it with a nod of thanks, tore it open, and read rapidly, his eyes moving across the words with practiced speed. When he looked up, there was satisfaction in his expression. "Mycroft has outdone himself," he announced, passing me the telegram. "Read this, Watson." I took the paper and read the neat typescript. Mycroft had indeed been thorough. According to harbour records, there had been 3 reports of unauthorised vessels in the Greenwich area over the past 3 weeks, all occurring during foggy conditions. Additionally, a small warehouse near the Greenwich docks had been leased 6 weeks ago by a company calling itself Maritime Historical Preservation Society, about which virtually nothing else was known. The telegram concluded with Mycroft's characteristic dry humour. "Suggest investigation. Sounds like your sort of nonsense. M.H. A preservation society," I mused, setting down the telegram. That could be entirely legitimate. It could, Holmes agreed. And yet, how curious that they should establish themselves in Greenwich precisely before these phantom ship sightings began. I think, Watson, that this Maritime Historical Preservation Society warrants our immediate attention. Fetch your coat and hat. The game is afoot. The journey to Greenwich was accomplished by train, the carriages rattling through the misty morning as London gradually gave way to the more open spaces along the river. Holmes sat in silence for much of the journey, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape, but his mind clearly elsewhere, working through possibilities and scenarios with that remarkable internal machinery that constituted his genius. I was content to watch the grey world slide past the windows, the trees emerging from and disappearing into the mist like ghosts of themselves, the river occasionally visible as a band of pewter light between the buildings. We disembarked at Greenwich Station into air that tasted of salt and river water, cool and clean despite the industrial character of the area. The docks stretched out before us, a forest of masts and cranes, warehouses and maritime buildings clustered along the waterfront like pilgrims gathered at a shrine. The mist softened everything, muffling sounds and reducing visibility to perhaps 100 yards, creating an atmosphere that felt simultaneously peaceful and slightly eerie. Holmes oriented himself quickly, consulting a small notebook in which he had copied the address from Mycroft's telegram, and then set off along the dock road with his characteristic long-legged stride. I followed, my walking stick tapping against the cobblestones in a steady rhythm, breathing in the complex scent of tar and fish, hemp rope, and coal smoke that characterized all maritime districts. The warehouse in question proved to be a modest structure of weathered red brick, 3 stories tall with large doors facing the dock, and smaller windows set high in the walls. It stood slightly apart from its neighbours, separated by narrow alleyways through which the mist drifted like slow water. There was no sign or placard identifying it as the headquarters of any historical society. Only a painted number above the door. 17. Holmes paused across the street, studying the building with narrowed eyes. Observe, Watson. The windows. Most are dark, but do you see there, on the second floor, the faintest suggestion of lamplight? I followed his gaze, and did indeed see a dim glow behind one of the high windows, so faint it might have been imagined. Someone is within, then. Indeed. And yet the doors are closed. The building presents no welcoming face to the world, not the behaviour one would expect from a legitimate society devoted to historical preservation, which surely would wish to attract members and visitors. He smiled slightly. I think we shall pay them a visit, Watson. Come. We crossed the street and approached the main doors, which proved to be secured with a substantial padlock. Holmes examined this briefly, then moved along the building's face, testing windows and searching for alternative entrances with practiced ease. I kept watch, though the street remained empty, save for a distant figure of a dock worker passing through the mist like a shade. Here, Holmes called softly from the alley. I joined him to find he had located a smaller door, also locked, but of older and less robust construction. He produced his lockpicks from an inner pocket, tools he carried as routinely as I carried my medical bag, and set to work with quiet concentration. The lock yielded in less than a minute, with a soft click that seemed loud in the muffled silence. The door opened onto darkness, and the smell of old wood, damp stone, and something else. A chemical scent I could not immediately identify, sharp and faintly acrid. Holmes produced a small electric torch from his pocket, a modern convenience he had recently acquired, and directed its beam into the interior, revealing a narrow corridor lined with wooden crates and coiled rope. Stay close, Watson, he murmured, and quiet. We are uninvited guests, and I should prefer to learn what we can before announcing our presence. We moved into the warehouse, the door closing softly behind us, and suddenly the world contracted to the circle of torchlight and the sounds of our own breathing and careful footsteps. The corridor led deeper into the building, past storage rooms filled with nautical equipment, brass fittings, canvas sailcloth, sections of wooden mast, all jumbled together in apparent disorder. The chemical smell grew stronger as we progressed, and I recognized it now. Phosphorus, or something similar, the kind of substance used in matches or in certain types of luminous paint. Holmes had noticed it too. I could tell by the set of his shoulders and the way his head tilted slightly, that hunting dog intensity that meant he was on the scent of something significant. We climbed a narrow stairway to the second floor, where the lamplight Holmes had observed from outside grew brighter, spilling from beneath a closed door at the corridor's end. As we approached, voices became audible, two men speaking in low, urgent tones, though the words were indistinct through the heavy door. Holmes extinguished his torch, and we stood in the darkness, listening. One voice was cultured, educated, speaking with the careful diction of a university man. The other was rougher, the accent of London's East End, impatient and aggressive. 3 more nights at most, the cultured voice was saying. The conditions must be perfect, and we cannot risk. Risk? The rougher voice interrupted. It's you that's taking risks, playing about with your fancy lights and your boats in the fog. Get on with it, I say, or others will. Patience, the first voice soothed. "The Society has invested considerable resources in this endeavour. We must ensure—" The sound of a chair scraping against floorboards cut off the rest, and footsteps approached the door from within. Holmes gripped my arm and drew me swiftly back along the corridor to a darkened doorway, pressing us both into the shadows, just as the door opened and a man emerged, carrying a lantern that swung arcs of light across the walls. He was tall and lean, dressed in the rough clothing of a dock worker, but moving with a predatory grace that suggested capability and danger. He passed within feet of our hiding place without seeing us, descending the stairs with heavy footfalls that gradually faded into the depths of the warehouse. When silence returned, Holmes released his grip on my arm and breathed out slowly. "Most illuminating," he whispered. "Come, Watson. I think we have learned what we came for. We should withdraw and reconsider our approach." We retraced our steps through the warehouse, moving more quickly now, emerging once more into the misty daylight with relief. The air outside tasted sweet after the chemical-tainted atmosphere within, and I drew it gratefully into my lungs as Holmes carefully ensured the door was closed behind us, leaving no trace of our intrusion. "Well," I said, once we had put some distance between ourselves and the warehouse, "that confirms your suspicions. Some kind of deliberate operation, though to what end remains unclear." "On the contrary, Watson, the end becomes clearer by the moment," Holmes replied, his eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. "Consider what we have learned. A society devoted to maritime history, a warehouse containing materials for creating luminous effects, men discussing timing and conditions and risks, and all of it centered on Greenwich, that symbolic heart of England's naval heritage." He paused at the dock's edge, looking out over the grey river where boats and barges moved like shadows through the mist. When he spoke again, his voice held a note of certainty. "Someone is staging these phantom ship appearances, Watson, but not as a mere prank or to frighten superstitious rivermen. No, this is a distraction, a spectacle designed to draw attention while something else occurs elsewhere. The question is, what?" A foghorn sounded in the distance, its mournful note rolling across the water, and somewhere out on the river, hidden in the mist, I imagined that glowing ship sailing its impossible course, and wondered what secrets moved beneath the surface of this mystery, waiting to be discovered in the patient unfolding of investigation and deduction that was Holmes's particular art. Holmes stood motionless at the water's edge for several long moments, the mist curling around him like something alive, his profile sharp against the grey backdrop of river and sky. I had learned over our years of friendship to recognize these silences. They were not empty spaces, but rather periods of intense mental activity, during which his remarkable mind sorted through data, constructed theories, discarded them, rebuilt them anew. When finally he stirred, turning back toward me with purpose renewed, I knew he had reached some conclusion. "We require more information," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the muffled atmosphere. "Specifically, we must understand what else has been occurring in Greenwich during these past weeks, while attention has been focused on phantom ships and spectral vessels. Watson, there is a public house near the dock gates, the Admiral's Rest, if memory serves. Dock workers and rivermen frequent such establishments, and the conversation in such places often reveals what official reports conceal. Shall we?" The Admiral's Rest proved to be exactly the sort of establishment one would expect in such a location. Low-ceilinged and dark, smelling of beer and tobacco smoke, with sawdust scattered across the floor and maritime memorabilia adorning every available wall surface. Ship's wheels, brass diving helmets, framed knots of every description, and faded photographs of vessels long since broken up or lost to the sea, created a museum of river life that felt both melancholy and comforting in equal measure. It was mid-morning still, too early for the establishment to be crowded, but a handful of men sat scattered about the room, nursing pints and speaking in low voices. The barkeep, a broad man with grey whiskers and the rolling gait of one who had spent years at sea, looked up as we entered, his expression neither welcoming nor hostile, but simply observant, measuring us with experienced eyes. Holmes approached the bar with easy confidence, laying a coin on the scarred wood surface. 2 bitters, if you please, landlord, and perhaps you might indulge our curiosity. We are visiting from London, drawn by tales of strange sightings on the river. The phantom ship, you understand. We thought to see it for ourselves, though I confess we are skeptics by nature. The barkeep drew our pints with practiced efficiency, the amber liquid flowing smoothly into the glasses. When he set them before us, his expression had softened slightly, curiosity evident in his weathered features. Skeptics, are you? Well, you're not alone in that, though there's them as has seen it and won't be convinced otherwise. Sebastian Thornwood, for one. Solid as they come, that man, not given to flights of fancy. We have heard Thornwood's account, Holmes said, sipping his bitter and nodding appreciation. Most intriguing. But tell me, has anything else of note occurred hereabouts recently? Sometimes strange events cluster together, I have found. The barkeep leaned against the counter, settling into the comfortable posture of one preparing to share information. Funny you should ask that. There has been talk, now you mention it. Nothing to do with ghosts and such, but peculiar nonetheless. The Royal Observatory. You know it, up on the hill? Well, there's been unusual activity there these past weeks. Comings and goings at odd hours, deliveries of equipment, men working through the night when normally the place is quiet as a churchyard after sunset. Holmes's expression remained casual, merely politely interested, but I felt the sudden focusing of his attention like a physical force. The observatory, how curious. Scientific work, I suppose, though I confess I am not familiar with the rhythms of astronomical observation. Nor am I, the barkeep admitted, but my nephew works on the grounds there, maintaining the lawns and such. He says there's been a new fellow appointed to some position. A Professor Blackwood arrived from Cambridge about 2 months back. Very particular about his privacy. Wants no one near his workspace in the evenings. Keeps the curtains drawn. Has special locks fitted to his rooms. A man seated nearby, who had been listening with apparent disinterest, now spoke up, his voice roughened by years of shouting orders over wind and wave. I've seen lights up there at night, moving about like someone signalling. Thought nothing of it at the time. Figured they were doing whatever it is astronomers do. But now, with all this talk of phantom ships and strange doings, it makes a fellow wonder. Holmes turned to the man with an expression of friendly interest. Signalling lights, you say? How intriguing. Did they follow any pattern? The man shrugged, draining the last of his pint. Couldn't say for certain. Just flashes, irregular like. But I'm a practical man, sir. I don't hold with supernatural nonsense. If there's strange lights on the river and strange lights on the hill, seems to me there might be a connection of the earthly variety, if you take my meaning. I take your meaning precisely, Holmes said warmly, and I commend your reasoning. Tell me, this Professor Blackwood, has anyone seen him about the town? What manner of man is he? The barkeep and the sailor exchanged glances, and it was the former who answered. Keeps to himself mostly. Tall fellow, they say, very thin, with a scholarly stoop. Wears spectacles thick as bottle bottoms. But he has visitors sometimes. Men who don't look like scientists, if you understand me. More your businessmen types, well-dressed but hard-faced. Holmes finished his bitter in a long draught and set the empty glass down with satisfaction. Most interesting conversation, gentlemen. You have given us much to consider. The observatory, you say, is it open to visitors? During the day, certain parts of it, the barkeep confirmed. The museum and such. But the working areas, where the astronomers do their observations and calculations, those are restricted. You'd need proper credentials or an appointment to visit Professor Blackwood, I should think. Then an appointment we shall arrange, Holmes said, producing another coin, which he left on the bar despite the barkeep's protest. For your time and information, which has been invaluable. Come, Watson, I believe we have a hill to climb. We emerged from the comfortable dimness of the public house into the mist-softened daylight, and Holmes set off immediately toward the steep path that led up Greenwich Hill toward the Royal Observatory. The climb was gradual but steady, the path winding between trees that loomed out of the fog like sentinels, their branches reaching overhead to create a tunnel of grey-green shadow. Our footsteps were muffled by fallen leaves, damp and fragrant with decay, and the sounds of the docks below gradually faded until we moved through a pocket of quietness, broken only by the occasional call of a crow, or the whisper of wind through branches. I found myself breathing more heavily as we climbed, while Holmes maintained his pace without apparent effort, his mind clearly racing ahead to our destination. You suspect this Professor Blackwood is involved in the phantom ship business? I asked when we paused at a turning of the path. I suspect that Professor Blackwood's presence and activities are too coincidental to be unrelated, Holmes corrected. The timing aligns too perfectly. His arrival 2 months ago, the establishment of the Maritime Historical Preservation Society 6 weeks ago, the phantom ship sightings beginning 3 weeks ago. There is a progression there, Watson, a careful building towards some culmination. And now we learn of mysterious lights and secretive behaviour at the observatory, which commands a perfect view of the river below. He gestured through the mist toward where the Thames would be visible on a clearer day. Consider the strategic value of that position. One could observe all river traffic, coordinate signals, direct movements. If one wished to stage a convincing phantom ship appearance, what better command post than an elevated position with scientific equipment and the authority that comes with association to the Royal Observatory? We resumed our climb, and presently the great buildings of the observatory complex emerged from the mist above us, their distinctive architecture somehow otherworldly in the grey light. The famous time ball, used for centuries to signal the hour to ships on the river, rose against the sky like a dark sphere suspended between heaven and earth. The buildings themselves were of red brick and white stone, elegant but purposeful, designed by Wren and his successors to serve the cause of navigation and astronomical science. The grounds were surprisingly quiet, only a few visitors wandering the paths despite the hour. A sign directed tourists toward the museum entrance, but Holmes led us instead toward the main observatory building, where working astronomers maintained their offices and conducted their research. A porter stood at the entrance, an elderly man in uniform who straightened at our approach. "Help you, gentlemen?" he inquired, polite but clearly prepared to deny us entry if our purpose was mere curiosity. Holmes produced a card from his pocket and presented it with the same ease he had shown countless times before. "Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, and my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are here on a matter that may concern one of your residents, Professor Blackwood. Is he available for consultation?" The porter examined the card with care, his expression neutral. "Professor Blackwood is engaged in his research at present, sir. He gave strict instructions not to be disturbed. If you would care to leave a message, I could ensure he receives it." "The matter is rather urgent," Holmes said, his tone suggesting polite insistence without quite crossing into rudeness. "It concerns certain activities that have been observed both here and along the river below. I think the professor would wish to be informed immediately." Something in Holmes's manner, perhaps the quiet authority he could project when necessary, or perhaps the specific mention of the river, caused the porter to hesitate. His gaze shifted between us, calculating, and then he nodded slowly. "Wait here, if you please. I will inquire whether the professor is willing to receive you." He disappeared into the building's interior, leaving us in the entrance hall with its marble floors and walls adorned with portraits of past astronomers. Royal, stern-faced men who had devoted their lives to charting the heavens and perfecting the science of navigation. Holmes moved about the space with apparent casualness, but I knew he was observing everything, cataloguing details that might prove significant. The porter returned sooner than I expected, his expression troubled. "The professor will see you, gentlemen, though he asks that you be brief. His work is at a critical stage, he says. Follow me, please." We were led through corridors lined with scientific instruments, brass telescopes and sextants, chronometers in glass cases, charts and calculations mounted behind glass. The building had that particular atmosphere of places dedicated to precise measurement and careful observation, a kind of reverent quietness that seemed appropriate to the pursuit of cosmic understanding. We climbed a narrow stairway to the upper floor where the working observatories were located, and finally stopped before a heavy wooden door marked with a brass plate, reading Professor A. Blackwood, Private Research. The porter knocked, and a voice from within called permission to enter. The door swung open to reveal a large room dominated by a substantial telescope pointing toward the ceiling, which opened through a retractable dome currently closed against the misty weather. Tables lined the walls, covered with papers, books, and various pieces of equipment I could not identify. And standing in the center of this organized chaos was Professor Blackwood himself. The descriptions had been accurate. He was tall and very thin, his body bent into a permanent scholarly stoop, as though years of peering through instruments had curved his spine. His spectacles were indeed remarkably thick, magnifying his eyes to an almost comical degree, and his hair, what remained of it, stood out from his head in wild grey tufts. He wore a stained laboratory coat over shabby tweeds, and his hands, I noticed, were marked with small chemical burns. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice surprisingly strong and clear, cultured with the particular accent of Cambridge. "I confess I am surprised to receive a visit from so celebrated a detective. And Dr. Watson, your chronicles of Mr. Holmes's cases have provided me with considerable entertainment. Please, gentlemen, come in. Forgive the disorder. The nature of my work requires a certain fluidity of organization." Holmes entered the room with his characteristic observant gaze sweeping across every surface. "Professor Blackwood, thank you for receiving us on short notice. Your work must indeed be compelling to keep you occupied at such hours and with such dedication. We have heard reports of lights burning here well into the night." Blackwood's expression flickered. Surprise, perhaps, or wariness. But he recovered quickly, gesturing toward chairs that were piled with papers. "Please, sit if you can find space. My research does require irregular hours. Yes, the observation of certain celestial phenomena cannot be scheduled according to human convenience. But surely you have not climbed Greenwich Hill to discuss my working habits." Holmes remained standing, moving instead toward one of the tables, where I now noticed several curious instruments. Glass vessels containing chemicals that glowed with a faint phosphorescent light, not unlike the glow described by witnesses to the phantom ship. He did not touch them, but his interest was evident. "Luminous compounds," he observed, "for marking instruments in darkness, I presume, or perhaps for other purposes, such as creating visible signals over distance." The atmosphere in the room had suddenly grown tense, charged with unspoken meaning. Professor Blackwood stood very still, his magnified eyes fixed on Holmes with an intensity that was almost alarming. When he spoke, his voice had lost its welcoming warmth, becoming careful, measured. "Mr. Holmes, I suspect you have not come here for a lesson in chemistry or astronomy. Perhaps you should state your purpose directly, and we can dispense with this dance of implications." The silence that followed stretched between them like something physical, a taut thread of tension humming in the cluttered observatory. Holmes turned slowly from the glowing vessels, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, creating a cocoon of grey light that made the room feel suspended outside of normal space and time. A place where truths might be spoken that could not be uttered in the ordinary world below. "Very well, Professor," Holmes said at last, his voice gentle but firm. "I shall be direct. Over the past 3 weeks, multiple experienced rivermen have reported sightings of a phantom ship on the Thames, always near Greenwich, always during foggy conditions, always moving in ways that defy natural explanation. During this same period, you have been observed conducting unusual activities here at the observatory. Lights at odd hours, secretive behavior, restricted access to your workspace. Additionally, a warehouse at the docks has been leased by an organization of dubious authenticity, and that warehouse contains materials suitable for creating luminous effects. These facts, taken together, suggest a coordinated effort to create an elaborate deception. What I wish to understand is why." Professor Blackwood had grown very pale during this recitation, his hands gripping the edge of the table behind him, as though for support. For a moment, I thought he might deny everything, order us from his laboratory, perhaps summon the porter to have us removed. But instead, something seemed to collapse within him. Not his posture, which remained upright, but some internal resistance. He moved to one of the chairs, sweeping papers onto the floor with a gesture of weary resignation, and sat heavily. "You are as formidable as your reputation suggests, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, removing his spectacles and rubbing his eyes with thumb and forefinger. Without the thick lenses, his face looked older, more vulnerable, deeply tired. "I confess I am almost relieved that you have discovered the truth. The deception has weighed upon my conscience more heavily than I anticipated." He replaced his spectacles and looked up at us both, his expression now one of appeal rather than defensiveness. "But before I explain, you must understand, I am not a criminal, gentlemen. What I have done in service of a cause I believe to be just and necessary, though I see now that my methods were perhaps misguided." Holmes moved one of the chairs and seated himself facing the professor, his manner transformed from interrogator to listener, that remarkable quality he possessed of making even those he pursued feel heard and understood. "Then, help us understand, Professor. Begin at the beginning, if you would. Why create a phantom ship?" Blackwood drew a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, and when he began to speak, his voice carried the careful precision of one who has rehearsed an explanation many times in his own mind. "I am an astronomer by training, as you know, but my particular area of research concerns the measurement of longitude and the improvement of maritime navigation. For 30 years, I have dedicated myself to this work, developing new instruments and techniques to make sea travel safer. 3 years ago, I proposed a revolutionary system, a network of coordinated light signals that could be used to guide ships through dangerous waters with unprecedented accuracy." He rose and moved to one of his tables, retrieving a sheaf of papers covered with diagrams and calculations. The system would use precisely timed phosphorescent signals, visible over great distances, coordinated from elevated positions like this observatory. Ships equipped with simple receiving instruments could determine their position, even in fog or darkness. It could save thousands of lives, Mr. Holmes. Thousands. "But your proposal was rejected," Holmes said, and it was not a question. "Rejected, dismissed, mocked," Blackwood confirmed bitterly. "The Admiralty, the Royal Society, the maritime insurance companies, none of them would provide funding. They said the system was too expensive, too complex, that traditional methods were sufficient. But traditional methods result in hundreds of shipwrecks every year, Dr. Watson. Hundreds of sailors drowned, cargo lost, families destroyed. And I had the solution, if only someone would listen." He paced now, agitation overcoming his earlier resignation, his words flowing faster. "Then, 6 months ago, I was approached by representatives of certain commercial interests, shipping companies, dock owners, merchants who lose fortunes to maritime accidents. They offered to fund a demonstration of my system, provided I could prove its effectiveness in a dramatic fashion. They suggested, they insisted, really, that we needed to capture public attention, to create a spectacle that would force the authorities to take notice. The pieces were falling into place now, the pattern emerging from the chaos." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. "And so the phantom ship was born, a demonstration of your light signaling system, but disguised as something mysterious and supernatural to generate publicity." "Precisely," Blackwood admitted. "We commissioned the construction of a vessel, a traditional 3-masted ship in miniature, only 40 feet in length, but faithful in every detail. The hull and sails were treated with my phosphorescent compounds, which can be activated by exposure to certain wavelengths of light. From this observatory, using a modified lighthouse lamp, I can illuminate the vessel when conditions are appropriate, making it appear to glow with its own light. The effect, I must admit, is quite convincing. I could not help but interject. But the movement, Professor. The witnesses reported the ship moving against tide and wind. How was that accomplished? A faint smile touched Blackwood's lips, the first genuine expression of pleasure he had shown. That, Doctor, is the most elegant part of the system. The vessel is not sailing freely, but is guided along cables laid on the riverbed, invisible beneath the water. It is drawn by an electric motor housed in the hull, powered by batteries. The cables were positioned weeks ago under cover of legitimate dredging operations. The ship follows a predetermined course, appearing to move impossibly, because observers cannot see the mechanism of propulsion. Ingenious, Holmes murmured, and there was genuine appreciation in his voice. And the crew? The figures witnesses reported seeing aboard? Articulated mannequins dressed in period clothing, also treated with phosphorescent paint, Blackwood explained. They are mounted on simple mechanisms that move them back and forth across the deck, creating the impression of activity. At a distance, especially in fog, the illusion is quite complete. The door to the laboratory opened suddenly, making us all start. A young man entered, carrying a tray with a teapot and cups, his expression preoccupied, until he looked up and saw Holmes and myself. He froze, recognition and alarm flashing across his features, and I realized with a shock that this was the same man we had seen leaving the warehouse that morning, the one with the dangerous grace of a predator. "Professor," he said, his East End accent confirming my identification. "I thought you were alone. These gentlemen—" "It is quite all right, Hargrove," Blackwood said wearily. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson have deduced our secret. There is no further point in concealment. Please, set down the tea and join us. You are as much a part of this as I am." Hargrove did as instructed, though his movements were careful, controlled, and he positioned himself near the door in a way that suggested military training, or worse. He was younger than I had thought from our earlier glimpse of him, perhaps 30, with sharp features and cold eyes that assessed us with professional thoroughness. Mr. Hargrove represents the financial interests backing this demonstration, Blackwood explained as he poured tea with steady hands, offering cups to each of us in turn. He has been instrumental in coordinating the practical aspects: the warehouse, the vessel construction, the river operations. "And the Maritime Historical Preservation Society?" Holmes inquired, accepting his tea. "A convenient fiction," Hargrove confirmed, his voice flat. "Necessary to secure the warehouse lease without attracting attention. The society exists only on paper." Holmes sipped his tea, his expression thoughtful. "I see. And when is the next demonstration planned? You mentioned to your colleague this morning that 3 more nights at most would be required." Hargrove's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You were in the warehouse." Briefly, Holmes admitted without apparent concern. "Long enough to confirm certain suspicions. But please, gentlemen, continue your explanation. What happens after these final demonstrations? What is the ultimate purpose?" Blackwood set down his cup, the the china clinking softly against the saucer. In 3 nights' time, there is to be a gathering of senior Admiralty officials, shipping magnates, and members of Parliament at the Naval College. A dinner, ostensibly to honour the retirement of Admiral Pemberton. But we have arranged, that is, Mr. Hargrove's associates have arranged, for these men to witness the phantom ship from the college terrace. And immediately following the sighting, I am to reveal the truth, to demonstrate that what they have seen is not supernatural, but scientific, and to present my navigational system as the solution to Britain's maritime safety crisis. A dramatic revelation, Holmes observed, designed to secure funding and official support through a combination of spectacle and social pressure. The assembled dignitaries will be too embarrassed by their own superstitious reactions to refuse a scientific solution, and too aware of public attention to the phenomenon to dismiss your work again. That was the plan, Blackwood said, and now his voice carried a note of defeat. But sitting here, explaining it to you, I hear how it sounds. Deception, manipulation, a kind of fraud, even though the underlying science is genuine. I am not a confidence trickster, Mr. Holmes. I am a scientist, and I have allowed myself to be convinced that the ends justify means that I now see were dishonourable. The room had grown darker as we spoke, the afternoon advancing, though the misty greyness made time difficult to judge. Hargrove remained by the door, silent and watchful, but I noticed his hand had moved to rest inside his coat, and I wondered what might be concealed there. The atmosphere had shifted from confession to something more uncertain, more potentially dangerous. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out over the grey expanse toward where the river lay hidden in mist. When he spoke, his voice was measured, carefully neutral. Professor Blackwood, I believe your motives were sincere, even if your methods were questionable. Your navigational system may indeed have genuine value, but you must understand that what you have created here is not merely a scientific demonstration, but an elaborate fraud that has caused considerable alarm among rivermen and the public. There are legal implications, consequences that must be considered. Are you going to expose us then? Blackwood asked, and there was resignation in his question, as though he had expected this outcome from the moment we arrived. Holmes turned back to face the room, his expression difficult to read. That depends, Professor, on what you intend to do now. The demonstration at the Naval College, if it proceeds as planned, with immediate revelation and explanation, presented as an educational exercise in the power of scientific innovation, it might yet achieve your goals without causing lasting harm. But it must be handled carefully, transparently, with full acknowledgement of the deception and sincere apology for any distress caused. Hargrove spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice hard. And if we refuse, if we tell you to mind your own affairs and leave us to our business? The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and I felt my hand move unconsciously toward my pocket, where I kept my service revolver. But Holmes merely smiled, a thin, dangerous expression quite unlike his usual warmth. Then, Mr. Hargrove, I would be forced to inform the authorities of an elaborate fraud being perpetrated on the Thames, complete with evidence of your warehouse operations, the identity of your financial backers, and the technical details of Professor Blackwood's apparatus. The resulting scandal would destroy not only this demonstration, but any possibility of the Professor's navigation system ever being taken seriously. Additionally, there would likely be criminal charges. Is that truly the outcome you prefer? The two men faced each other across the cluttered laboratory, and I could feel the weight of decision hanging in the air between them. Hargrove's hand was still inside his coat, and I found myself calculating distances, angles, wondering if it would come to violence in this space dedicated to measuring the stars and perfecting humanity's relationship with the sea. Then Blackwood spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "No, Hargrove. Mr. Holmes is right. We proceed as planned with the Naval College demonstration, but we do so openly, honestly. I will present my system on its scientific merits, not through trickery and manipulation. If it has value, that value will be recognized. If not, then perhaps I have been deluding myself about its importance." Hargrove stared at the professor for a long moment, then slowly withdrew his hand from his coat, empty. "Your decision, Professor, though my associates will not be pleased with this development. They invested substantial funds expecting a guaranteed result. Then your associates will have to accept disappointment," Blackwood said, and there was steel in his voice now, the strength that must have sustained decades of research in the face of rejection. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes, for showing me what I should have seen myself, that a worthy goal does not excuse unworthy methods." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I suggest, Professor, that you spend the next 3 days preparing a presentation that emphasizes the legitimate applications of your phosphorescent signaling system. Dr. Watson and I will attend the Naval College demonstration to ensure matters proceed appropriately. And perhaps—" his expression softened slightly, "perhaps your system will prove as revolutionary as you believe. Science has certainly produced stranger miracles." We took our leave shortly thereafter, descending the hill through the thickening mist as afternoon surrendered to evening. The lights of Greenwich were beginning to glow below us, soft and warm against the grey, and the river moved in darkness, patient and eternal, keeping its secrets while above, in the observatory, a troubled scientist contemplated the consequences of ambition wedded to deception. 3 days passed in a peculiar suspension of ordinary time, each one marked by the same grey mist that had settled over London like a living thing, reluctant to release the city from its damp embrace. Holmes spent these days in restless activity, alternating between long periods of silent contemplation in his chair by the fire and sudden bursts of energy during which he would disappear for hours, returning with cryptic comments about visits to shipping offices, conversations with harbour officials, consultations with chemists regarding the properties of phosphorescent compounds. He was building something in his mind, I knew, constructing a complete understanding of Professor Blackwood's apparatus and its implications, ensuring that no detail had been overlooked, no possibility left unconsidered. On the second evening, as rain joined the mist in a soft percussion against our windows, Holmes emerged from one of his absences carrying a package wrapped in brown paper, which he set carefully on the cluttered table near his chemistry apparatus. When I inquired as to its contents, he merely smiled and said it was insurance, nothing more, leaving me to wonder at his meaning, while he returned to his customary chair and his pipe, wreathing himself in clouds of smoke that mingled with the coal fire's exhalations, until he seemed half ghost himself, a figure composed more of thought than substance. The morning of the third day arrived with no change in weather, the mist, if anything, grown thicker, reducing visibility to mere yards and muffling all sound, until London felt like a city of whispers and suggestions, rather than solid buildings and bustling life. We breakfasted in near silence, Holmes consuming only coffee, while I worked through Mrs. Hudson's excellent kedgeree. And then we prepared ourselves for the evening ahead with the care of soldiers readying for battle, though the conflict we anticipated would be one of words and revelations, rather than violence. "You still carry your revolver, I trust?" Holmes asked as we were preparing to depart, his tone casual but his eyes serious. "Always," I confirmed, patting the pocket where the familiar weight rested. "Do you anticipate trouble?" "I anticipate unpredictability," he replied, shrugging into his overcoat. "Hargrove's associates, whoever they may be, have invested considerable resources in this venture. Men who make such investments do not always accept disappointment gracefully. It is best to be prepared." The journey to Greenwich was accomplished in a hired carriage, the driver proceeding at a cautious pace through streets transformed by mist into mysterious corridors, where buildings loomed and vanished like the scenery of dreams. Holmes sat opposite me, his profile barely visible in the grey light that filtered through the windows, his fingers drumming a restless pattern on his knee, the only outward sign of the tension I knew he must be feeling. For all his confidence in Professor Blackwood's intentions, we were entering a situation with multiple actors, competing interests, and the possibility of outcomes we had not anticipated. The Naval College at Greenwich rose from the mist like a vision of classical grandeur, its colonnaded buildings and graceful courtyards. Designed by Wren to be a testament to Britain's maritime supremacy, tonight lights blazed from every window despite the early evening hour, and carriages were drawn up before the main entrance, depositing elegantly dressed men, naval officers in full uniform, gentlemen in evening dress, a few women in fine gowns, adding splashes of colour to the predominantly masculine gathering. The retirement dinner for Admiral Pemberton was clearly a significant social occasion, exactly as Blackwood and his associates had planned. We presented ourselves at the entrance, where Holmes produced an invitation that I knew must have been obtained through his brother Mycroft's influence, and were admitted into a world of marble floors and soaring ceilings, gilt mouldings and enormous paintings depicting famous naval battles. The sound of conversation and laughter echoed through the spaces, hundreds of voices creating a susurrus like waves against a distant shore, punctuated by the clink of crystal and the rustle of silk and taffeta. Holmes navigated through the crowd with his usual facility for moving unnoticed when he wished, and I followed in his wake, nodding politely to those few faces I recognized from my years in London society. We made our way toward the river-facing terrace, where French doors stood open despite the chill, and where already a number of guests had gathered, drinks in hand, looking out over the darkened Thames with the idle curiosity of those seeking a brief respite from social obligation. "There," Holmes murmured, gesturing subtly with his glass of champagne toward a group of men standing near the balustrade. "Admiral Sir James Markham, head of the Admiralty's Navigation Committee. The portly gentleman beside him is Sir Edmund Hartley, chairman of Lloyd's of London, and the tall fellow with the monocle. That is Lord Ashford, Parliamentary Secretary for Maritime Affairs. Professor Blackwood has assembled quite an audience." I scanned the gathering, searching for the professor himself, and finally spotted him near the far end of the terrace, engaged in conversation with a distinguished-looking gentleman whose uniform marked him as the evening's honoree, Admiral Pemberton. Blackwood appeared nervous, his gestures more animated than usual, his gaze frequently straying toward the river, and then up toward the observatory hill, invisible in the mist and darkness, but commanding this reach of water from its elevated position. The dinner was announced, and the crowd began moving back inside toward the great hall, where tables had been laid with the finest china and silver. Holmes and I allowed ourselves to be carried along with the flow, but positioned ourselves near the doors to the terrace, where we could observe both the gathering and the river beyond. The meal proceeded with the stately ritual of such occasions, course following course, each accompanied by appropriate wines, speeches, and toasts, interspersed between the service, the conversation gradually growing louder and more relaxed as alcohol and good food worked their mellowing influence. I noticed that Blackwood barely touched his food, his attention constantly divided between the windows and a pocket watch he consulted with increasing frequency. Hargrove I had not seen, but I assumed he was positioned somewhere outside, coordinating the phantom ship's appearance according to whatever schedule had been arranged. The timing would need to be precise, I realized. The guests sufficiently relaxed and receptive, the darkness complete, the mist still thick enough to enhance the illusion. It was during the final course, as port was being poured, and the elderly Admiral Pemberton was rising to deliver his farewell address, that I felt Holmes stiffen beside me. Following his gaze toward the windows, I saw what had caught his attention, a faint glow on the water, distant and diffuse, barely visible through the mist, but unmistakably present, and growing brighter by the moment. "It has begun," Holmes breathed, and there was tension in his voice that I rarely heard. "Watch carefully, Watson. The next few minutes will determine whether Professor Blackwood's career ends in triumph or disaster." The glow on the river was attracting attention now, guests near the windows falling silent and pointing, their exclamations interrupting the Admiral's speech. He paused mid-sentence, turning to look, and then the entire gathering was moving toward the terrace, drawn by that most powerful of human impulses. The need to witness the extraordinary, the inexplicable, the potentially dangerous. We moved with them, emerging onto the terrace where the cold mist enveloped us immediately, carrying with it the smell of the river and something else. That chemical tang I had noticed in the warehouse, phosphorus burning in controlled reaction to produce its uncanny light. The phantom ship was fully visible now, perhaps 200 yards offshore, a 3-masted vessel glowing with ethereal luminescence, every line and curve visible as though lit from within by captured moonlight. The effect was indeed spectacular, beautiful and eerie in equal measure, and I could hear the gasps and murmured exclamations of wonder from the assembled dignitaries. "My God," breathed Admiral Markham, his weathered face slack with amazement. "It cannot be real, and yet—" "It appears to be moving," Sir Edmund Hartley observed, his practiced eye tracking the vessel's progress. "Against the tide, unless I am much mistaken. How is such a thing possible?" This was the moment, I realized, when Professor Blackwood should step forward with his revelation, transforming wonder into understanding, channeling the audience's amazement toward acceptance of his navigational system. I looked for him in the crowd, and found him near the balustrade, his face illuminated by the phantom ship's glow, his expression not triumphant, as I had expected, but troubled, deeply uncertain. Holmes had seen it too. "Something is wrong," he murmured, and began moving toward the professor, threading through the captivated crowd with practiced efficiency, I followed, my hand unconsciously checking for my revolver. That soldier's instinct, responding to Holmes's alarm without conscious thought. We reached Blackwood's side just as he turned from the spectacle, his face pale, his eyes wide behind his thick spectacles. "Mr. Holmes," he said urgently, keeping his voice low so as not to be overheard by the nearby guests. "The ship, it is not following the planned route. Something has gone wrong with the cables, or—" he paused, swallowing hard. "Or someone has altered the course deliberately. It is moving toward the docks, toward the warehouses." Holmes gripped the professor's arm, his voice sharp with command. "Where exactly? Which warehouses?" "The ammunition storage facilities," Blackwood replied, and now I understood the source of his fear. The Navy maintained stores of gunpowder and explosives there, awaiting transport to Portsmouth. If the ship collides with that dock, if the phosphorescent compounds react with the stored materials. He did not need to complete the thought. The potential for catastrophe was clear. "Hargrove," Holmes said flatly, "or his associates. They have decided that a mere demonstration is insufficient. They intend to create an actual disaster, something that will force immediate action and funding, regardless of the cost in lives or property." The phantom ship continued its impossible glide through the mist, beautiful and terrible, heading with inexorable purpose toward the distant docks where death and destruction waited in barrels and crates. The assembled guests remained captivated, unaware that they were witnessing not a clever illusion, but the prelude to potential tragedy. Holmes released Blackwood's arm and turned to me, his face set in grim determination. "Watson, we must reach that ship before it reaches the ammunition dock. There must be a way to stop it, to cut the cables, or disable the motor. Professor, how much time do we have?" Blackwood consulted his pocket watch with shaking hands. "At its current speed, perhaps 15 minutes, no more than 20. Then we must move quickly." Holmes turned and began pushing through the crowd, no longer concerned with discretion, with me close behind. We reached the terrace steps and descended toward the riverside path, the sounds of the party fading behind us as we entered the mist-shrouded darkness, racing against time and human malevolence toward a glowing ship that sailed through fog like a harbinger of catastrophe, its beauty concealing deadly intent. The riverside path was treacherous in the darkness and mist, the cobblestones slick with moisture, uneven and broken in places where tree roots had pushed through from below, or where decades of weather had taken their toll. Holmes ran with long, loping strides, his coat streaming behind him, his focus absolute, while I followed as best I could, my older legs protesting the sudden exertion, but adrenaline driving me forward. Behind us, the sounds from the Naval College had begun to change, the murmur of wonder giving way to confused alarm as someone, perhaps Professor Blackwood himself, had finally raised the warning about the ship's true trajectory. We rounded a curve in the path, and suddenly the docks spread before us, a confusion of piers and warehouses, moored vessels and stacked cargo, all rendered strange and otherworldly by the mist that transformed solid objects into suggestions, mere sketches of reality. And there, perhaps 300 yards offshore, the phantom ship glided through the water with supernatural grace, its phosphorescent glow creating a sphere of light that moved through the darkness like a witch-fire, beautiful and ominous. Holmes stopped abruptly, scanning the waterfront with rapid, calculating eyes. "There," he said, pointing toward a small rowboat tied to one of the nearer piers. "It will have to suffice. Come, Watson, quickly." We descended rough wooden steps to the pier level, our footsteps hollow on the planking, and reached the rowboat, which proved to be a humble fishing dory, equipped with oars and smelling strongly of old rope and fish. Holmes was already untying the mooring line when I clambered aboard, the boat rocking alarmingly under our combined weight. Within moments we were free, and Holmes had seized the oars, pulling with powerful strokes that sent us shooting out into the river's dark expanse. The current fought us, pulling sideways and down, and the mist closed around us like a curtain, cutting us off from the shore with startling completeness. Only the phantom ship remained visible, that glowing beacon now perhaps 200 yards distant, and Holmes rowed toward it with grim determination, his breath coming hard but steady, his eyes fixed on the target. I positioned myself at the bow, straining to see through the mist, watching for obstacles, debris in the water, moored boats, any of the 100 hazards that might lurk unseen in the darkness. "There!" I called suddenly, pointing to our left, where a massive shape was resolving from the mist. The ammunition warehouse, a long, low building extending out over the water on heavy pilings, with warning signs barely visible in the gloom, declaring the dangerous nature of its contents. The phantom ship was perhaps 100 yards from collision now, still moving with that uncanny steadiness, guided by whatever mechanism had been implemented to override Professor Blackwood's original course. Holmes altered our trajectory, angling to intercept, but it was clear we would not reach the ship before it struck the warehouse. We were too far, the distance too great, our humble rowboat too slow, despite Holmes's powerful rowing. I felt a sick certainty settling in my chest. We were going to witness catastrophe, helpless to prevent it. Then Holmes shipped the oars suddenly, reached inside his coat, and withdrew the mysterious package he'd brought home 2 days earlier. He tore away the wrapping to reveal a very pistol, a flare gun of the type used to signal ships at sea, and several flares. "The phosphorescent compounds," he said rapidly, loading the pistol with practiced efficiency. "Blackwood mentioned they are activated by certain wavelengths of light, but they can also be deactivated, temporarily blinded by intense illumination. If I can strike the ship with a flare, it may disrupt the glow enough to make it visible from shore, to alert anyone in the warehouse to evacuate." "Can you make the shot from this distance?" I asked, knowing even as I spoke that we had no choice but to try. "We shall discover the answer momentarily," Holmes replied, and there was a ghost of his old humour in his voice, despite the desperate circumstances. He raised the pistol, bracing his arm against the gunwale to steady his aim, tracking the phantom ship's movement through the mist. For a moment he was absolutely still, holding his breath, calculating wind and distance and the rocking motion of our small boat. The pistol fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the water, and the flare arced through the mist like a comet, trailing brilliant red fire. It struck the phantom ship amidships, and the effect was immediate and dramatic. The phosphorescent glow flickered, dimmed, entire sections going dark, as the intense light overwhelmed the chemical reaction. The ship became suddenly visible as a physical object rather than a glowing apparition. We could see the wooden hull, the canvas sails treated with luminous paint, the mannequins positioned on deck. But more importantly, we could see the figure of a man crouched at the stern, his hand on what appeared to be a control mechanism. Even at this distance, I recognized Hargrove's lean form, his predatory posture. He looked up as the flare struck, his face briefly illuminated, and I saw shock and rage war across his features. "There is your saboteur," Holmes said grimly, already loading another flare. "He has been guiding the ship manually from aboard, overriding the cable system. A simple enough modification, I suppose, for someone with engineering knowledge and malicious intent." The ship was less than 50 yards from the warehouse now, close enough that I could see the weathered wood of the pilings, read the warning signs painted in faded red letters. Holmes fired the second flare, this one striking the vessel's bow, and more of the glow died away, revealing the true nature of the craft. Not a phantom at all, but merely a clever construction of wood and canvas and chemicals, manipulated by human hands toward human purposes. Hargrove had seen us now, had recognized that his plan was failing. He abandoned the control mechanism and moved toward the ship's rail with alarming speed, and I saw something in his hand catching the flare light. A pistol of his own, more lethal than Holmes's signaling device. "Down!" I shouted, but Holmes had already reacted, throwing himself flat in the bottom of the boat as Hargrove fired. The shot went wide, buzzing past like an angry wasp, but he was already adjusting his aim for a second attempt. I drew my revolver, my old service weapon that had accompanied me through Afghan campaigns and countless London investigations, and returned fire. The shot was hasty, poorly aimed from the unstable platform of a rocking boat, but it had the desired effect. Hargrove ducked behind the phantom ship's rail, giving us a moment's respite. The ship struck the warehouse pier with a hollow boom that echoed across the water, the impact gentler than I had feared. The vessel's light construction and relatively slow speed, resulting in damage rather than catastrophe. But even as relief washed through me, I saw flames beginning to lick at the ship's bow, where splintered wood had been driven into phosphorescent paint. The friction and impact triggering ignition. "The fire will reach the warehouse," Holmes said urgently, already seizing the oars again. "We must get aboard, must pull the ship away from the pilings before—" He left the sentence incomplete, but the implication was clear. If fire reached the stored ammunition, the resulting explosion would devastate this entire section of the waterfront. We closed the remaining distance rapidly, our small boat bumping against the phantom ship's side with a solid thunk. Holmes secured our painter to a projection of decorative carving and hauled himself up the hull with athletic grace, disappearing over the rail. I followed more slowly, my older muscles protesting, my revolver clutched awkwardly in one hand as I climbed. I gained the deck to find Holmes and Hargrove locked in struggle, both men grappling for control of Hargrove's pistol. They moved across the tilted deck with the desperate intensity of mortal combat, crashing into the mannequins that tumbled and fell with grotesque parody of death, their phosphorescent paint leaving glowing smears where they struck the deck. The fire at the bow was spreading, feeding on canvas and rope, the flames bright and hungry, casting dancing shadows that made the scene even more nightmarish. Smoke was beginning to pour upward, thick and acrid, mixing with the mist to create a choking fog that burned the lungs and stung the eyes. I moved toward the struggling men, my revolver raised but unable to get a clear shot as they spun and twisted. Then Hargrove broke free suddenly, bringing his weapon up, and I fired purely on instinct, the soldier's training that never truly leaves. My shot struck his shoulder, spinning him around, and his own pistol fired harmlessly into the deck before clattering from his grip. He staggered backward, clutching his wounded shoulder, his face contorted with pain and fury. "Fools," he snarled, his East End accent thick. "You have no idea what you have interfered with. The money behind this, the men who commissioned this demonstration, they will not forgive failure. Then they shall have to add our names to their list of disappointments," Holmes replied coolly, retrieving Hargrove's fallen pistol. "Watson, see if you can find some means of separating this vessel from the warehouse. I shall ensure our friend here causes no further trouble." I moved toward the bow, where the ship remained locked against the pilings, the fire now seriously established, flames climbing the forward mast and beginning to eat into the sail canvas with greedy enthusiasm. The heat was intense, driving me back, but I could see that the ship's bowsprit had become wedged between two pilings, holding the vessel fast against the warehouse structure. Through the smoke and flames, I glimpsed movement inside the warehouse. Men running, carrying crates and barrels with desperate haste, evacuating the stored ammunition. Someone had seen our flares, had understood the danger, and was taking action. But would they be fast enough? Could they remove enough of the explosive material before fire reached it? I found a boat hook secured to the rail and used it to try to lever the bowsprit free, pushing with all my strength against the heavy timber. Behind me, I could hear Holmes instructing Hargrove to lie flat on the deck, securing him with rope salvaged from the rigging. The fire roared and crackled, consuming the phantom ship's carefully crafted illusion, reducing Professor Blackwood's demonstration to ash and smoke. The bowsprit shifted suddenly, groaning against the pilings, and with a final heave I managed to free it. The ship began to drift away from the warehouse, pulled by current and wind, the separation measured in inches at first, then feet. The immediate danger was passing, though the vessel itself was clearly doomed, the fire having progressed too far to be controlled with the limited resources available to us. "Watson, we must abandon ship," Holmes called, his voice cutting through the roar of flames. "She is lost, and we have done what we came to do. Help me with our prisoner." Together, we hauled the protesting Hargrove to the rail, where our rowboat still bobbed alongside. Getting him down into the smaller craft with an injured shoulder and bound hands proved challenging, but fear of the spreading fire motivated even Hargrove to cooperate, and within minutes we were pulling away from the burning phantom ship, rowing hard for the shore. Behind us, the beautiful, terrible vessel that had glided through mist like something from legend blazed against the darkness, a pyre visible for miles, its light no longer the gentle glow of phosphorescence, but the fierce brilliance of destruction. The assembled dignitaries at the Naval College would be witnessing this finale, I realized. This transformation of illusion into catastrophe narrowly averted. And I wondered what Professor Blackwood must be feeling, watching his dreams burn on the Thames. We reached the shore to find it alive with activity, lanterns bobbing through the mist like terrestrial stars, voices calling orders and acknowledgements, the organized chaos of men responding to emergency with practiced efficiency. Dock workers and sailors formed human chains, passing barrels and crates from hand to hand, evacuating the ammunition warehouse with impressive speed. Fire brigades were arriving, their engines clanging through the streets, horses snorting and stamping as they were brought to halt. Men leaping down to deploy hoses and pumps with the urgency the situation demanded. Holmes secured our boat, and we hauled Hargrove onto the pier, where several constables materialized from the confusion, summoned by someone with the foresight to alert the authorities. Holmes identified himself and delivered our prisoner into official custody with brief explanations that left the officers looking bewildered but willing to accept his authority. Hargrove said nothing, his face pale with pain and perhaps the dawning realization of consequences. His earlier arrogance burned away as thoroughly as the phantom ship still blazing offshore. A familiar voice called Holmes's name, and we turned to find Professor Blackwood hurrying toward us through the mist, his coat flapping, his spectacles askew, his expression one of mingled relief and anguish. He stopped before us, breathing hard, and for a moment simply stared at the burning vessel visible in the distance, its light reflecting off the water in shimmering bands of orange and gold. "I am sorry," he said at last, his voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am profoundly sorry. I allowed myself to be manipulated, to be convinced that deception in service of a worthy goal was acceptable. And now—" He gestured helplessly toward the flames. "Now, people might have died because of my arrogance, my desperate need for validation and funding." Holmes laid a hand on the professor's shoulder, his grip firm but kind. "No one has died, Professor. The warehouse was evacuated in time, the fire will be contained, and the only casualty is the vessel itself, which was, after all, merely a construct of wood and paint. Your system, your genuine scientific innovation, survives intact. What has been destroyed is only the illusion, the deception. Perhaps that is not entirely a tragedy." Blackwood removed his spectacles and wiped his eyes. Whether from smoke or tears, I could not say. "The Admiralty officials, they will never take my work seriously now. After this scandal, this catastrophe I nearly caused, my reputation is ruined. 30 years of research, all the calculations and innovations, worthless. On the contrary, came a new voice, cultured and carrying effortless authority. And we turned to see Admiral Sir James Markham approaching, accompanied by several other distinguished gentlemen from the Naval College dinner. The Admiral's uniform was immaculate, despite the chaos around us, his bearing upright and commanding, but his expression was thoughtful rather than angry. "Professor Blackwood," the Admiral said, coming to stand before the dejected scientist. "I have spent the last quarter hour in conversation with several witnesses, piecing together the events of this extraordinary evening. I understand that you created the Phantom ship as a demonstration of your navigational signaling system, that you intended to reveal the truth in controlled circumstances, but that your associates had other plans." Blackwood nodded miserably, unable to meet the Admiral's eyes. "That is correct, sir. I allowed myself to be used, to participate in deception. There is no excuse for my conduct." The Admiral was silent for a long moment, gazing out at the burning ship, his weathered face illuminated by its glow. When he spoke, his voice was measured, considering. "I will not pretend that I approve of your methods, Professor. Deception, even in service of science, sits poorly with me. However—" He paused, and now he looked directly at Blackwood. "I have also spent 30 years in naval service. I have seen too many good ships founder in fog, too many sailors lost to navigational errors that might have been prevented with better tools. If your system genuinely offers improvement, If it can save even a fraction of the lives lost annually to maritime accidents, then it deserves serious consideration, regardless of the unfortunate circumstances of this demonstration. Blackwood's head came up slowly, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Sir, you cannot mean—" "I mean precisely what I say," the Admiral replied. "Present your system to the Admiralty properly, through official channels, with full technical documentation, with honest demonstration of capabilities and limitations. No more phantoms, no more theatrical productions. If it has merit, and I suspect it does, or you would not have devoted your career to it, then merit will be recognized. I give you my word that you will receive fair hearing." The relief that washed across Blackwood's face was profound, transforming him in an instant from defeated man to one granted unexpected reprieve. "Thank you, Admiral. Thank you. I will do exactly as you suggest. Honestly, transparently, with no deception whatsoever." Sir Edmund Hartley, the Lloyd's chairman, stepped forward now, his portly frame wrapped in an expensive overcoat, his expression shrewd beneath bushy eyebrows. "A system that reduces maritime insurance claims would be of considerable interest to my organization, Professor. I suggest you include Lloyd's in your official presentations. We have substantial resources to invest in genuinely effective safety innovations." The fire on the river was being brought under control now, the fire brigade's pumps sending arcs of water onto the burning vessel, clouds of steam rising to mingle with the smoke and mist. The immediate danger had passed. The ammunition warehouse stood intact, though scarred, and the only loss was the phantom ship itself. That beautiful illusion, now reduced to charred timbers, settling slowly into the Thames's dark waters. Holmes and I took our leave of the gathering as soon as propriety allowed, walking back along the riverside path toward where we might find a cab to carry us home. The mist was beginning to thin at last, the first signs of clearing weather showing in the eastern sky where stars were becoming faintly visible through gaps in the cloud. Our footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, a steady rhythm that felt almost meditative after the chaos and danger of the past hours. "An interesting case," I observed, breaking the comfortable silence between us. "Though, I confess, at the outset, I thought we were investigating supernatural phenomena." Holmes chuckled, a warm sound in the darkness. "There is no such thing, Watson. There are only phenomena not yet explained, mysteries not yet solved. Though I grant you, this one had more complexity than most. Professor Blackwood's motivations were sincere, even if his methods were misguided, and Hargrove's interference nearly turned demonstration into disaster." "What will happen to Hargrove, do you think?" I asked. "He will face charges of reckless endangerment at minimum, possibly attempted destruction of government property, depending on how the prosecutors choose to proceed. His mysterious backers will likely abandon him now that the scheme has failed so publicly. Men who operate in shadows rarely stand by associates when light is shone upon their activities." Holmes paused, tilting his head back to observe the clearing sky. A cautionary tale, really. Noble goals do not excuse ignoble means, and those who convince themselves otherwise often discover the price of such rationalization is higher than anticipated. We found a cab waiting near the Naval College gates and directed the driver toward Baker Street. The journey home was peaceful, London gradually emerging from its envelope of mist as we travelled through the late evening, gas lamps creating golden pools along streets that were beginning to show their familiar faces once more. I found myself drowsy, the adrenaline of danger fading, leaving only pleasant exhaustion and satisfaction of crisis successfully navigated. You brought the flare pistol specifically in anticipation of needing to disrupt the phosphorescence, I said, the realization coming to me as sleep began to pull at my consciousness. You knew something might go wrong. I suspected the possibility, Holmes admitted. Hargrove struck me as the type of man who would not be content with half measures. His conversation with Blackwood in the warehouse suggested impatience, a desire for more dramatic results than a mere scientific demonstration would provide. And men who deal in deception often find themselves deceived in turn. Blackwood trusted Hargrove and his associates, never imagining they might alter the plan for their own purposes. It seemed prudent to prepare for contingencies. Your preparation saved lives tonight, I said quietly. Holmes waved away the compliment with characteristic dismissal of praise. We both acted as circumstances required, Watson. Your shooting was quite accurate, given the difficult conditions. The Afghan campaigns clearly left you with skills that remain sharp despite the passage of years. The cab rolled to a stop before 221B Baker Street, and we emerged into the cool night air, now significantly clearer, the mist having retreated to mere wisps along the gutters and around the bases of the gas lamps. Mrs. Hudson's windows glowed with welcoming light, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the sanctuary of home, for the familiar rooms waiting above, for the peaceful conclusion to what might have been tragedy. Holmes paid the driver, and we ascended to our sitting room, where the fire had burned down to comfortable coals, and the familiar clutter of our daily existence seemed infinitely precious after the strangeness of the evening. I poured us each a brandy from the decanter, while Holmes settled into his chair with a contented sigh, stretching his long legs toward the hearth. Tomorrow I shall write up a full report for Scotland Yard, he said, accepting his glass with a nod of thanks. And I believe I shall also write to Mycroft, thanking him for his assistance and informing him that the phantom ship of the Thames has been explained, captured, and in rather literal fashion laid to rest. He will appreciate the closure and the confirmation that his intelligence regarding the Maritime Historical Preservation Society was accurate. I settled into my own chair, savouring the smooth burn of brandy warming my throat. And Professor Blackwood will have his chance to present his navigation system properly. Indeed, I have hopes that good may ultimately come from this peculiar affair. If his system proves viable, if it genuinely reduces shipwrecks and saves lives, then the deception that began this sequence of events will be redeemed by its ultimate outcome. Though the path was crooked, the destination may yet be worthy. Outside, London slept beneath clearing skies, and somewhere on the river the tide turned, as it had for countless centuries, indifferent to human drama and mystery, flowing eternal and patient toward the distant sea. Morning arrived with unexpected brilliance, the fog and mist of recent days having dissipated entirely during the night, leaving London washed clean and sparkling beneath a sky of pale autumn blue. Sunlight streamed through the windows of Baker Street with almost aggressive cheerfulness, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams, transforming our familiar sitting room into something luminous and new. I woke to this brightness with a sense of renewal, as though the clearing weather had swept away more than mere moisture from the air, had somehow cleansed the very atmosphere of shadows and mystery. Holmes was already awake when I emerged, seated at his desk with newspapers spread before him, several of which featured prominent headlines regarding the previous evening's events. "The phantom ship revealed," proclaimed the Times. "Scientific demonstration goes awry at Greenwich," announced the Telegraph. Each publication offered its own interpretation of the affair, some more accurate than others, but all agreeing on the essential facts that a clever hoax had been exposed, potential disaster averted, and various questions raised about funding for maritime safety innovations. "The press has been surprisingly restrained," Holmes observed, glancing up from his reading. "I had anticipated more sensational coverage, but it appears that Admiral Markham gave an interview emphasizing the legitimate scientific aspects of Professor Blackwood's work. A generous gesture, particularly given the circumstances." I poured myself tea from the pot Mrs. Hudson had left, adding cream and sugar while studying the newspapers over Holmes's shoulder. Public opinion seems divided between fascination with the technical achievement and disapproval of the deceptive methods. "As it should be," Holmes replied, folding the papers with decisive movements. "Both reactions are justified, but what matters is that the truth has been established, the danger averted, and Professor Blackwood given opportunity to proceed honestly henceforth. Speaking of which..." He rose from his chair and moved to the mantelpiece, retrieving an envelope that had evidently been delivered earlier. "We have been invited to visit the professor at the observatory this afternoon. He wishes to thank us personally and to show us the technical details of his signaling system. I thought we might accept. Are you amenable to one final journey to Greenwich, Watson?" The prospect of understanding more fully the mechanisms behind the phantom ship intrigued me, and the afternoon was fine for travel, so I agreed readily. We spent the morning in pleasant domesticity, Holmes attending to correspondence, while I updated my notes on the case, capturing details while they remained fresh in memory. Mrs. Hudson provided an excellent lunch of cold chicken and salad, and by early afternoon we were once again bound for Greenwich, this time travelling beneath clear skies that revealed the river in all its working glory. Barges and steamers plying their trade, the water reflecting the autumn sun in glittering ripples. The observatory grounds were transformed by sunlight, the buildings no longer mysterious shapes looming from mist, but handsome structures of classical design, their brick and stone warm and welcoming. Visitors strolled the paths, families with children studying the historical instruments on display, couples enjoying the spectacular views across the Thames Valley toward distant London. The atmosphere was one of peaceful learning, appropriate to a place dedicated to the expansion of human knowledge through patient observation and calculation. Professor Blackwood met us at the entrance, and the change in his demeanour from our previous encounters was remarkable. The nervous anxiety had been replaced by calm purpose, the haunted look in his eyes supplanted by clarity and determination. He greeted us warmly, shaking our hands with genuine gratitude, and led us not to his laboratory, but to a different room, one that faced directly down toward the river and the docks. "This is where I directed the illumination apparatus," he explained, gesturing toward a complex arrangement of lenses and mirrors mounted on a sturdy tripod positioned before the window. "It is essentially a modified lighthouse lamp, capable of producing an intense beam of ultraviolet light. The phosphorescent compounds coating the ship responded to this specific wavelength, glowing in return. From this elevated position, I could illuminate the vessel at the precise moment required, creating the appearance of spontaneous luminescence. Holmes examined the apparatus with evident interest, his fingers tracing the arrangement of lenses, understanding the principles immediately. "Elegant," he murmured. "And the ship itself. What has become of the wreckage?" "Salvaged this morning," Blackwood replied, "or what remained of it. The fire destroyed much, but enough survives to demonstrate the basic construction. I have arranged for the remnants to be transported to the Admiralty's Technical Assessment Facility, where engineers can examine the cable guidance system and electric propulsion. Despite the unfortunate circumstances, the underlying innovations may prove valuable for other applications." He moved to the window, looking down at the river flowing peacefully in the afternoon light. "I spent much of last night in reflection, gentlemen, about ambition and ethics, about the difference between dedication to a cause and obsession that blinds one to moral boundaries. I convinced myself that the deception was justified because my system could save lives, but I failed to consider that the deception itself endangered lives. The irony is not lost on me. Wisdom often arrives through painful experience," Holmes observed gently. "What matters is that you recognize the lesson and allow it to inform future conduct. The Admiral's offer of official consideration for your work. Have you begun preparations for that presentation?" Blackwood's expression brightened. "Indeed, I have. I have been working since dawn on technical documentation, stripping away all theatrical elements to focus purely on the practical applications. The phosphorescent signaling has genuine utility for marking channels in fog, for creating visible waypoints that require no power source beyond initial activation. Combined with precise timing and coordination, it could revolutionize navigation in difficult conditions." He led us to another table where plans and diagrams were spread out, annotated with careful script, showing proposed implementations of the signaling system for various harbours and shipping lanes. As he explained the technical details, I could hear the passion in his voice, the genuine belief in the value of his life's work, but now tempered with humility and awareness of practical limitations. This was not the desperate man who had commissioned a phantom ship to force attention to his ideas, but a scientist prepared to submit his innovations to rigorous evaluation and accept the verdict of experts. We spent perhaps an hour in discussion, Holmes asking probing questions about efficiency, reliability, potential failure modes, while Blackwood answered with thoroughness and honesty, acknowledging uncertainties rather than over-promising capabilities. It was, I reflected, how scientific progress should occur, through careful examination and debate, rather than theatrical demonstration and manipulation of public opinion. As our visit was concluding, Blackwood walked with us back through the observatory grounds toward the main gate. The afternoon sun was beginning its decline toward the western horizon, painting the sky in gentle shades of gold and amber, the quality of light soft and forgiving. Other visitors were departing as well, families tired from their explorations, couples walking hand in hand, the peaceful flow of people enjoying education and beauty in equal measure. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Blackwood said as we reached the gate, "I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your intervention. You saved lives, prevented catastrophe, and yet you also gave me opportunity for redemption, rather than simply exposing my folly to complete ruination. That is a gift I shall not forget." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Use the gift well, Professor. Let your work speak for itself, honestly and clearly. If it has merit, that merit will be recognized, and if it does not, well, then you will have the satisfaction of knowing you tried with integrity, which is its own form of success. We parted ways there, Blackwood returning to his laboratory and his calculations, while Holmes and I descended the hill once more toward the river and the docks below. The walk was pleasant in the golden afternoon light, the air clean and cool, carrying scents of grass and earth rather than the chemical tang of phosphorus and deception. The river below reflected the sky, a ribbon of gold winding through the landscape, peaceful and eternal. Another case concluded, I remarked as we reached the waterfront. Though I confess, this one took unexpected turns. I thought we were investigating supernatural phenomena and discovered instead very human motivations of ambition and desperation. Most mysteries resolve to human motivation when properly examined, Holmes replied. Fear, greed, ambition, love, revenge, these are the true engines of the seemingly inexplicable. The phantom ship was merely a tool, a means to an end, and like all tools, it reflected the character of those who wielded it. In Blackwood's hands, it was intended as demonstration and education. In Hargrove's hands, it became a weapon, the same object, transformed by intention. We found a tea shop near the docks and settled at a table by the window, ordering tea and cakes from a pleasant waitress who brought them promptly. The establishment was warm and comfortable, filled with the gentle murmur of conversation from other patrons, the clink of china, and the homely smell of fresh baking. Outside, the river traffic continued its eternal dance, vessels coming and going, the commerce of a great maritime nation proceeding with steady purpose. What is your point? I asked, curious about this philosophical turn. Simply this, Watson, that we must maintain appropriate skepticism, even of our own perceptions, must always question and probe beneath surface appearances. But we must also maintain appropriate wonder, must not become so cynical that we dismiss the genuinely extraordinary when it appears. The balance between skepticism and openness, that is the detective's art, and perhaps the art of living wisely as well. I sipped my tea, considering his words. You believe Professor Blackwood's system may prove genuinely revolutionary? I believe it has potential, Holmes replied carefully. Whether that potential is realized will depend on many factors beyond the professor's control. Funding, political will, the resistance of established interests to innovation. But he has earned the right to try, and that is more than he had before this affair began. Sometimes, failure transformed into honest effort is a kind of victory. The afternoon was fading into early evening when we finally departed the tea shop and made our way to the station for the journey home. The train carried us through landscapes bathed in the golden light of late autumn, fields and forests preparing for winter's sleep, the Thames occasionally visible as a gleaming thread winding through the gathering dusk. Other passengers dozed or read newspapers, the carriage filled with that particular quietness of day's end, when energy wanes and thoughts turn toward home and rest. Baker Street welcomed us with lamplight in the windows and the smell of Mrs. Hudson's cooking drifting up from below. Roast beef and potatoes, if my nose did not deceive me. We climbed the familiar stairs to our sitting room, where the fire had been laid and required only a match to spring to cheerful life. I lit the coals while Holmes sorted through the day's post, and within moments we were settled into our customary chairs, the day's adventure becoming memory, folding itself into the accumulated experience of years lived in partnership and friendship. I shall write up the case for your publication, if you wish, I offered. The phantom ship of the Thames. It has a certain ring to it. By all means, Holmes agreed, though perhaps emphasize the human elements. Blackwood's struggle between ambition and ethics, Hargrove's corruption of a potentially noble endeavour into something dangerous. The technical details are interesting, but it is the moral dimensions that give the case its lasting significance, I think. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour, the sound floating through the darkening air like a benediction over all the human striving and hope that filled the streets below. Several weeks passed in the gentle rhythm of late autumn, the days growing shorter and cooler, London settling into that particular atmosphere of approaching winter, when firesides become especially precious, and the comforts of home take on renewed significance. Holmes occupied himself with various small cases during this period, matters that required his attention but lacked the dramatic scope of the phantom ship affair. A forged will, a matter of industrial espionage involving textile patterns, the mysterious disappearance of a collection of rare stamps that proved to have been hidden by their owner during a bout of absent-mindedness brought on by excessive sherry consumption. Each case was resolved with Holmes's characteristic efficiency, but I sensed in him a certain restlessness, as though he were waiting for something, some news or development that had not yet arrived. The answer came on a grey November afternoon, when a messenger delivered a thick envelope bearing the seal of the Admiralty. Holmes opened it immediately, his eyes scanning the contents with increasing interest, and when he looked up, his expression carried satisfaction, and something that might have been vindication. "It is from Admiral Markham," he explained, passing me several pages of official correspondence. Professor Blackwood presented his phosphorescent signalling system to the Admiralty Technical Committee 3 days ago. They have conducted preliminary tests, and the results are, well, read for yourself, Watson. I took the papers and read with growing amazement. The committee had found Blackwood's system to be not only functional, but potentially transformative for maritime navigation. The phosphorescent compounds, when properly formulated and applied, provided reliable illumination lasting up to 8 hours, visible at distances exceeding 2 miles in fog or darkness. The coordination system, using precise timing and predetermined patterns, allowed ships to determine position with accuracy previously impossible in poor visibility. Most remarkably, the cost of implementation was modest compared to traditional lighthouse construction and maintenance. The Admiralty was recommending immediate funding for a pilot program to be implemented at 3 harbours notorious for difficult navigation conditions. Professor Blackwood would oversee the installation and testing, with full recognition as the system's inventor. Additionally, Lloyd's of London had committed substantial private funding for expanded development, convinced by actuarial analysis showing potential for significant reduction in maritime insurance claims. "Extraordinary," I murmured, setting down the papers. After all his struggles, after years of rejection, Professor Blackwood will see his life's work implemented after all. "Justice of a sort," Holmes agreed, retrieving the correspondence and folding it carefully. "Though achieved through a circuitous and nearly disastrous route. I wonder if the professor reflects on how differently matters might have proceeded had he simply persevered through official channels, rather than resorting to theatrical demonstration. Perhaps the demonstration, despite its complications, was necessary, I suggested. It captured attention in a way that dry technical proposals never could. Sometimes unconventional approaches yield results even when they go awry. Holmes smiled at that, an expression of amused agreement. A generous interpretation, Watson, and perhaps not entirely wrong. Human affairs are rarely as straightforward as we might wish. The path from intention to outcome winds through territory we cannot always predict or control. The letter included a postscript inviting us to attend the official ceremony announcing the Admiralty's decision, to be held the following week at the Royal Society. Professor Blackwood had specifically requested our presence, and Admiral Markham added his own encouragement, noting that without our intervention, the entire matter might have ended in tragedy rather than triumph. We attended the ceremony on a cold but clear December afternoon. The Royal Society's hall filled with an impressive assembly of naval officers, scientists, government officials, and maritime industry representatives. Professor Blackwood stood near the front, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the attention, but also transformed from the desperate, haunted man we had first encountered. He had acquired new spectacles, less comically thick, and wore a well-tailored suit that suggested his financial circumstances had improved along with his professional prospects. The Admiral's speech was mercifully brief and remarkably generous, acknowledging the unusual circumstances of the system's demonstration, while emphasizing the solid science underlying the innovation. He spoke of Britain's maritime heritage, the thousands of lives lost annually to navigational errors, and the nation's obligation to embrace technologies that enhanced safety regardless of how unconventionally they might have been revealed. When he concluded by formally announcing the Admiralty's adoption of the Blackwood phosphorescent navigation system, the applause was genuine and sustained. Blackwood himself spoke next, and his words carried a humility and honesty that I found deeply moving. He acknowledged his errors of judgment, thanked those who had given him a second chance despite his lapse in ethical conduct, and dedicated the system to the memory of all sailors lost at sea. He spoke without notes, from the heart, and I saw several of the crusty naval officers in attendance, nodding approval at his candour. The formal proceedings concluded with refreshments and conversation, the assembled guests breaking into smaller groups to discuss technical details, implementation schedules, and various maritime matters. Holmes and I found ourselves approached by Professor Blackwood, who gripped both our hands with evident emotion. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "I owe you a debt I can never adequately repay. Not merely for preventing catastrophe that night on the river, but for showing me that redemption was possible, that one could acknowledge error and still move forward with integrity. That lesson was perhaps more valuable than any scientific breakthrough." "Use your success wisely, Professor," Holmes replied warmly. "Let this system save the lives it was designed to protect, and let that be your legacy, rather than the circumstances of its revelation. The past is fixed, but the future remains open to shaping by present choices." We spoke for some time longer, discussing technical refinements Blackwood was planning, the locations selected for initial implementation, his hopes for eventual expansion throughout the Empire's ports and harbours. His enthusiasm was infectious, genuine passion uncorrupted now by desperation or willingness to compromise principles for results. This was science as it should be, I thought, pursued with rigour and honesty. tested openly, contributing to human welfare without requiring deception or manipulation. As the afternoon faded toward evening and the gathering began to disperse, Holmes and I took our leave, stepping out into the December cold with our breath visible in plumes of vapour. The streets were already darkening, gas lamps being lit by their tenders, shop windows glowing with warm invitation. We walked rather than taking a cab, both of us seeming to desire the time and space to reflect on what we had witnessed. A satisfying conclusion to the affair, I observed, as we strolled through the lamplit streets. The professor has his recognition. His system will save lives, and even the manner of its revelation has been transformed from scandal to interesting footnote. Indeed, Holmes agreed, though I confess I find myself contemplating the larger questions the case raises. How many innovations, I wonder, have been lost because their inventors lacked not scientific insight, but the resources and connections to gain proper hearing? How many Professor Blackwoods have given up in despair, their potentially valuable work never implemented because the mechanisms for evaluating and funding scientific research favour established figures over outsiders? You suggest the system is flawed, I asked. I suggest that systems created by humans inevitably reflect human imperfections, Holmes replied. Bias toward the familiar, reluctance to embrace the genuinely novel, the influence of wealth and social position over merit. Professor Blackwood's resort to theatrical demonstration, while ethically problematic, was born of decades of frustration with a system that repeatedly rejected work we now know to have substantial value. There is culpability on both sides of that equation. We walked in contemplative silence for several blocks, the city flowing around us with its evening rhythms, workers returning home, theatres and restaurants preparing for their nightly service, the great breathing organism of London transitioning from day to night. Holmes seemed lost in thought, his sharp features illuminated intermittently by the gas lamps we passed, and I knew he was working through the philosophical implications of the case, with the same thoroughness he applied to material evidence. What became of Hargrove? I asked, partly from genuine curiosity, and partly to draw Holmes from his introspection. He pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment and several related charges, Holmes replied. Received 18 months imprisonment. His mysterious financial backers never materialized to provide legal assistance, as I predicted. Men who commission illegal schemes rarely stand by their agents when matters go wrong. He will emerge from prison to obscurity, I expect, and perhaps to reconsideration of life choices that led him to value money over human welfare. And the warehouse, the Maritime Historical Preservation Society, I inquired further. The society was dissolved, the warehouse lease terminated. The equipment and materials were seized as evidence, but will likely be returned to Professor Blackwood after the legal proceedings conclude. Some of it may prove useful in legitimate applications of his system. Holmes paused at a corner, orienting himself, then led us down a quieter street, lined with residential buildings. The entire apparatus of deception has been dismantled, leaving only the genuine innovation that was always at its core, a kind of purification, perhaps. We arrived at Baker Street to find our sitting room warm and welcoming, Mrs. Hudson having laid the fire and left a tray with cold supper, sliced ham, cheese, fresh bread, and a bottle of claret. We settled into our familiar chairs with grateful sighs, the day's formality giving way to comfortable domesticity. Holmes poured wine for us both, and we toasted silently to conclusions satisfactory if imperfect, to justice achieved through complex paths, to human capacity for both error and redemption. I shall add this case to my notes as one of the more philosophically interesting investigations, Holmes mused, swirling wine in his glass and watching the firelight play through the ruby liquid. Not because of complexity in the mystery itself, which was relatively straightforward once properly examined, but because of what it revealed about motivation, ethics, and the sometimes contradictory demands of principle and pragmatism. You sound almost sympathetic to Professor Blackwood's initial deception, I observed. I am sympathetic to his frustration, to his desperation to see valuable work recognized and implemented, Holmes clarified. I am not sympathetic to his choice to resolve that frustration through fraud, however well-intentioned. The distinction is important, Watson. We can understand how someone arrives at poor decisions without endorsing those decisions. Compassion and judgment are not mutually exclusive. The fire crackled, settling deeper into its bed of coals. And outside, the sounds of London continued their evening symphony. Distant traffic, voices in the street, the clatter of a passing cart. I found myself feeling deeply content, satisfied not merely with the case's resolution, but with the larger sense of order restored, of chaos resolved into understanding, of mysteries illuminated by the steady application of reason and observation. The phantom ship sails no more, I said quietly, almost to myself. Its glow has faded into memory and newspaper archives, but the real innovation, the genuine contribution to maritime safety that endures and will save lives for years to come. A fitting epitaph for the affair, Holmes agreed, raising his glass in salute. To Professor Blackwood, to redemption through honest effort, and to the eventual triumph of substance over spectacle. We drank to that, and then sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around us. Two friends in a warm room, while outside the great city pursued its endless purposes. While on the Thames, ships passed through darkness, guided now not by phantom lights, but by the promise of innovations born of dedication, and refined through the difficult crucible of acknowledged error. Winter had fully established itself over London by the time the new year arrived, bringing with it crisp mornings when frost painted the windows in delicate patterns and breath hung visible in the cold air. The city had taken on that particular quality of deep winter when firesides become kingdoms and the simple act of warmth assumes profound importance. Holmes and I had settled into our customary winter routine. The sitting room at Baker Street, transformed into a sanctuary against the cold, the fire perpetually burning, tea perpetually brewing, the comfortable rhythm of domestic life, punctuated by occasional cases that drew us out into the frozen streets. It was on a particularly bitter January evening, snow falling in soft silence beyond our windows, that a final letter arrived regarding the phantom ship affair. Holmes recognized Professor Blackwood's handwriting on the envelope and opened it immediately, his expression growing pleased as he read. When he finished, he passed the letter to me without comment, settling back in his chair with his pipe and a look of quiet satisfaction. The professor's letter was brief but eloquent. The first installations of his phosphorescent navigation system had been completed at 3 harbours, exactly as the Admiralty had promised. Initial results were exceeding expectations, with several vessels already reporting successful navigation through fog conditions that would previously have required anchoring and waiting for visibility to improve. More significantly, the system had already prevented what would likely have been a serious collision between a merchant vessel and a passenger ferry in Southampton Harbour, the glowing markers providing clear guidance when traditional navigation aids were invisible in heavy fog. Blackwood wrote with gratitude and humility, acknowledging once more his debt to Holmes and to the second chance he had been given. But more than personal sentiment, his letter radiated purpose and hope. Additional funding had been secured for expansion to 20 more harbours over the coming year. International interest was developing, with maritime authorities from France, Germany, and the Netherlands all making inquiries. What had begun as a desperate deception had been transformed into a legitimate innovation with potential to save countless lives across the world's oceans. The letter concluded with an invitation for us to visit the Southampton installation at our convenience, to see the system in actual operation rather than merely as a theatrical demonstration. Blackwood expressed his desire to show us what genuine application looked like, stripped of all pretense and fraud, functioning as it had always been intended to function. A satisfying denouement, I remarked, folding the letter and returning it to Holmes. The professor seems to have found both professional success and personal peace. He has learned what many never do, Holmes replied, smoke curling from his pipe like incense in a temple. That the difficult path of honest effort, while slower and more frustrating than shortcuts through deception, leads to destinations that can be occupied with clear conscience. Success achieved through fraud is hollow, but success earned through integrity, even when that integrity is learned through painful error, has weight and substance. I rose from my chair and moved to the window, looking out at the snow falling through the lamplight, each flake visible for a moment before joining the accumulation on street and rooftop. London was being transformed into something clean and new, the dirt and grime of daily existence covered by winter's gentle erasure. Children would wake tomorrow to find their world changed, made magical by this covering of white. And for a time, the ordinary would become extraordinary through simple transformation of surface appearance. Holmes rose and joined me at the window, standing beside me as we watched the snow fall. An astute observation, Watson. We are surrounded by illusions. The illusion that the sun rises when in fact the earth rotates. The illusion of solid matter when in truth all substance is mostly empty space, populated by invisibly small particles in constant motion. What we call reality is merely the level of illusion that our senses can perceive and our minds can process. Science does not eliminate illusion, but rather layers understanding upon understanding, each level revealing that what seemed solid truth is merely useful approximation. We stood together in companionable silence, watching winter work its ancient magic on the city below. Somewhere out there, on the Thames, now running dark and cold between frozen banks, ships moved through the night, guided by innovations born of desperation, and refined through acknowledgement of error. And further away, in harbours we would never see, other vessels were finding their way through darkness and fog, their captains trusting to glowing markers that transformed dangerous passages into navigable channels. "Shall we accept the professor's invitation?" I asked. "Visit Southampton and see the system in operation?" "I think not," Holmes replied softly. "Our role in this affair is concluded, Watson. We solved the mystery, prevented the catastrophe, and created the space for redemption to occur." What happens now belongs to Professor Blackwood and to the larger forces of scientific progress and maritime commerce. We would be mere spectators to developments that no longer require our participation. You prefer to remember it as we experienced it, I suggested. The glowing ship moving through mist, the race against time, the moment of crisis and resolution. I prefer to remember that we did what was necessary when it was necessary, Holmes corrected gently. The rest, the implementations and expansions, the saved lives and prevented tragedies, those will accumulate in the background of history, important but invisible to most observers. That is as it should be. The best outcomes of detective work are often the disasters that never occur, the crimes that never take place, the tragedies that are quietly averted. Such things do not make dramatic stories, but they represent the highest expression of our purpose. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the hour, its gentle tones marking the passage of time in our warm sanctuary. 10 o'clock, the evening still young, but the day effectively concluded, the world outside settling into night's embrace while we remained cocooned in firelight and friendship. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard below, moving through her evening routines, and the familiar sounds of home surrounded us like an embrace. Holmes returned to his chair, and I to mine, each of us taking up books and settling into that comfortable state of shared solitude that long companionship permits, present to each other without demanding constant interaction. The silence between us full of understanding rather than empty of communication. The fire burned steadily, consuming its fuel in the patient alchemy that transforms wood to warmth to ash, the eternal cycle continuing as it had for millennia, as it would for millennia more. I found my thoughts drifting as I read, moving from the words on the page to memories of fog-shrouded rivers and glowing ships, of professors desperate for recognition and criminals willing to endanger lives for profit, of the moment when understanding bloomed from confusion and mystery, resolved into explanation. How many such moments had Holmes and I shared over our years together? How many puzzles had we unravelled? How many shadows had we illuminated with the light of reason and observation? And yet, I reflected, the mystery never truly ended. Each solution revealed new questions. Each answer opened doors to further inquiry. Professor Blackwood's phosphorescent navigation system would save lives, but those lives would continue to unfold with their own mysteries, their own struggles and triumphs, their own moments requiring choices between integrity and expedience. The work of understanding, like the work of living, was never complete, but always ongoing, always demanding renewed commitment to honesty and careful observation. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the city in silence, transforming the familiar into something strange and beautiful. And inside, in the warm sanctuary of Baker Street, two friends sat reading by firelight, their day's work completed, their evening stretching peacefully before them, the mysteries of the world waiting patiently beyond the windows for tomorrow's investigation, tomorrow's illumination, tomorrow's patient work of revelation. The phantom ship had sailed its last voyage, had surrendered its secrets to inquiry and analysis, had been transformed from mystery to memory to lesson. Its glow had faded from the Thames, but persisted in the innovations it had inadvertently birthed, in the lives it would indirectly save, in the reminder it provided that even our errors, if acknowledged and learned from, can become foundation for achievement. And so, the story ends as all stories must, not with dramatic flourish, but with the gentle settling of understanding into place, with the satisfaction of questions answered and purposes served, with the quiet pleasure of mysteries solved and order restored to the portion of chaos we could touch. The fire burns lower, the hour grows later, and somewhere outside the night continues its ancient passage toward dawn. If you have enjoyed this journey into the fog-shrouded world of Victorian mystery, where reason and wonder walk hand in hand through gaslit streets and along misty rivers, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, to like this story if it brought